Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. And today I have a short story for you because it is Short Story Tuesday, one that fulfills the around part in the Around the Weird. One that is about a haunting ? I am referring to Casa Tomada, or House Taken Over, by Julio Cortázar, which was published in 1946. For those who don't know, Julio Cortázar was an Argentinian writer, as well as a translator later in his life, and a poet, and among many other things, and a professor who wrote quite a bit about sort of magical realism and sort of historical prose and all sorts of things like that. Writing graphic novel, poetry, novels, you name it. What's interesting is that he was a professor prior to, even during when he was writing, like in the 1940s. And then Juan Perón got elected after he participated in overthrowing the government at the time. And Juan Perón instituted quite a few Peronist ideals, including helping the working class. And this put him at odds with the elites of society, like the professors and the landowners and whatnot, including Julio Cortázar, who was kind of forced to resign from his professorship, and he sort of lived abroad in France and various other areas. And you kind of see that reflected in his work as well. And from there, he was a translator and did a couple other things in his life, including he went to Cuba, where he had a political awakening. I don't quite know for what end, whether he was pro or anti-socialism, but that's that's about how his life turned out. And then he later died in the 70s or the 80s, I think. Pretty interesting writer, one that I've never heard of, but I'm happy that I found here today. And without further ado, let's talk about Casa Tomada. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Casa Tomada focuses on an unnamed narrator and his sister Irene living in a large, spacious manor house, alone. They're not married. In fact, the narrator's wife or girlfriend died prior to the start of the story, and they just don't have anyone but each other, which they figure it should be fine. They don't want to sell this house, even though it would get them quite a pretty penny selling either the house or the materials that it's made out of. But they figure, they'll live there, and then when they die, some distant cousins will inherit the house and sell it and become rich off of it, which they don't seem too upset about. The narrator notes that Irene enjoys knitting and makes a joke that that women often knit because they realize it's a great time doing nothing. And the narrator enjoys collecting stamps or going through his grandparents' stamp collection. But near the start of the story, the narrator begins hearing strange noises in one wing of the house. They can't quite identify where the noises are coming from, and in fact, it sounds like they're coming from multiple rooms at once. And so the narrator tells Irene this, and they flee to another wing of the house and sort of block off that other wing. And they say, specifically, the narrator says that belongs to them now. Who exactly are them? That remains to be seen. But they seem to have an okay time in this other wing of the house, although their personal noises seem to become amplified at that point. It becomes a little bit of claustrophobic to them, specifically with Irene kind of talking in her sleep, and Irene noting that the narrator just wiggles all around in his sleep, throws off the covers and whatnot. Doesn't seem to be too comfortable. So things become slowly worse for them as time progresses. But near the end of the story, they begin hearing the strange noises again. Again, not being able to identify where they're coming from, but Irene and the narrator decide that now is the perfect time for fleeing. And as the story ends, the narrator notes that they feel a bit of dread as they leave the house. They don't quite see anything to indicate that there's actually a haunting there, but they note that they're gonna like throw away the keys to make sure that nobody else can access this house again, and that's where the story ends. In terms of analysis, Cortázar provides us with a little bit to think about here. The first thing that he sort of writes about and does pretty well here is with the enormity of the house. Specifically, Cortázar describes a very spacious manor of vast proportions, sort of noting that like you enter the house through a large gate, and to get into like the living quarters, you need to enter a large wrought iron gate or something like that. And each room is very big. Specifically, the narrator notes that like 8 people could live in this home and not get in each other's way. And right now, there's only 2 people living there, sort of showing that it's way too big. And indeed, like it might be too big because the narrator and Irene don't seem to be interacting too much, at least at the start of the story. They're just doing their own thing, and they come meet for dinner and lunch and breakfast and stuff like that. So there's quite a bit of loneliness and isolation in this story. A house of this size, if you're not interacting, you're going to be isolated from everyone else. It might produce, mental health concerns, or you might start to imagine the company of others in different ways. Like the size of the house itself could explain some of the strange things that are going on within the house as the story progresses. And as the house becomes more blocked off, as they block off like one wing of the house and they force themselves to reside in the other, all the sounds seem to be getting larger, and it becomes more claustrophobic for the characters. Kind of showing that if you block off, even a small part of the house, even though it's very large, like you're still stuck together, and you're forced to become like used to all of the annoying things about your brother or your sister. And even though this house is supposedly very large, because of the strange things that are happening in it, it's not as large as you might think it might be. Like you're still dealing with something much smaller, and I guess you kind of have to stick together, which would make things claustrophobic. So kind of contrasting there as the story goes on, which I really like from Cortázar. And another thing worth mentioning in this story is the haunting. And so the question is the narrator and the sister, are they being haunted in this story? Is there an actual ghostly presence or something more sinister going on there? Because they hear strange noises, but there's no source of those noises. And in fact, the narrator can't quite locate the source of those noises. Because they seem to be coming from 2 different places at once, and eventually the narrator just stops looking because he feels like, they're here, like whoever they are, and so he decides to stop really like looking for it and just seclude his sister and him in another side of the house. And then there's also feelings of dread, especially as the narrator leaves. Now, what is the source of that dread? That could be, a ghostly presence, or it could be just a feeling that something's not quite right here. I don't know what that dread is coming from. It's a very weird statement to make without quite specifying what's the source of that dread on Cortázar's part. But there seems to be all the elements of a haunting here without an actual presence that indicates that a haunting is here. More of the idea that a haunting is around. And so you could have alternate explanations for what's going on here. The haunting could be psychological. It could all be in Irene and the narrator's minds. That because this house is so large and because they are isolated and lonely, it's producing this haunting effect for them. Like they're making up these sounds in order to maybe be closer to one another, or to sort of create another presence to not feel so lonely. So it could all be in their heads. They could also be dealing with quite a few, mental health effects, because Irene seems to be lonely as well, and the narrator's girlfriend recently died in the recent past or something like that, and that loneliness, that grief could have produced something awful for the narrator, mentally speaking, and you have that psychological effect that might produce a haunting. The characters may be losing their minds in the enormity of this home. Or it could also be interpersonal, the narrator and his sister not really getting along, and sort of creating this imaginary presence to get them closer together, but then realizing they don't really have anything in common and they don't really like being in each other's company. And so eventually they just, bring the ghost even closer, and that forces them to flee, and they finally don't have to be together anymore. Something interesting to consider there. I don't think that's probably what Cortázar is getting at, though. And then another possible explanation is the historical one. As I noted, Cortázar was forced out of his professorship and really forced to leave Argentina by Juan Perón. He didn't want to be a part of that government with that person, and so the answer could be Peronism. Like the Peronists are in this wing of the house. We have to flee to another part of Argentina. Oh, the Peronists are here. We have to flee Argentina altogether. That sounds like a decent explanation. I don't know enough about Peronism to go into more detail about it, but it's certainly something to consider, and it's also something that in my research I've learned more and more about as it pertains to this story. So that could be a good explanation. But ultimately, I feel like because there are no straight answers with the haunting, and because this might be a metaphor for Peronism more than anything else, I feel like it hurts the story because I'm sure, he sets it up for there to be a mystery and a ghostly reveal, kind of like what I was talking about with The Grip of It by Jack Jem last month, and how there never seemed to be a real answer, and she just kept leaving it in the air. And I feel like Cortázar does the same thing, and it really hurts the story here, unfortunately. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Casa Tomada by Julio Cortázar. It's an okay short story. I don't really enjoy it too much, unfortunately, just because of the sort of, it's a ghost story without a ghostly reveal. It's just characters feeling like they're being haunted and running away from their house, and I felt like there could have been more there. And indeed, it's a 3-page short story, and Cortázar could have written even more. And that I think the inherent issue is that this is a metaphor for Peronism or anti-Peronism, and Julio didn't really intend to write a ghost story, which is unfortunate. It feels like the story really only works if you know who Juan Perón is, and I myself, I didn't know too much about Juan Perón. So maybe only Argentinians from the time period or historians will really be able to get the short story, which is unfortunate. I guess I recommend you to read this out there just to get a feel for who this author is. Maybe I might check out another one of his short stories in the future just so I can get a better understanding of who this feller is. But if you read this before, you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Let's have a discussion about Casa Tomada. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author and this short story if they do not already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and ghostly travels. Farewell.